Parental alienation is counterintuitive to any professional who doesn't specialize in the area and to even some who do. When something's counterintuitive, one shouldn't use intuition, even professional intuition, unless it's specialty level. Those who don't understand this typically get almost everything wrong, and it's a recipe for disaster. Parental alienation requires a sophisticated understanding, special knowledge, and rational analysis. However, the brain tends to rely on intuitive thinking, which can be fast, frugal, and helpful, but can also be inaccurate and misleading. You see, when the brain encounters an unfamiliar or difficult problem, it tends to substitute a different, more familiar problem that's easier to deal with. That's an unconscious, powerful bias and a dangerous error in professional practice. In this video, we'll discuss 13 counterintuitive points related to parental alienation. Number 1. The high conflict model improperly assumes that both parents are significantly responsible for the family dynamics. It fails to properly consider the possibility that one party might be the aggressor and the other is in defense mode, trying to manage a horrific family crisis. From both clinical and legal perspectives, use of the high conflict model in a case of parental alienation is one of the worst mistakes one can make, but most professionals use it. Number 2, alienating parents typically present well, and targeted parents typically present poorly. Observers often confuse behavior that's temporary or caused by circumstances with personality or character behavior that's internal and permanent. That's called the fundamental attribution error. Observers often attribute qualities to a speaker based upon what he or she says about others. Communicators become associated with the traits they describe in others, even when there's no logical basis to make such an inference. Alienating parents typically present with the 4 C's: cool, calm, charming, and convincing, because they're master manipulators. In contrast, alienated parents typically present with the 4 A's: anxious, agitated, angry, and afraid, because they're trauma victims. Number 3, most mental health and legal professionals lack the expertise to properly handle parental alienation. Causes of parental alienation require a sophisticated understanding of certain advanced clinical and medical concepts. Few mental health clinicians and even fewer lawyers have had any training in these concepts. Worse, they don't know what they don't know. Number 4, the clinical and legal literature is filled with misinformation and disinformation spread both unintentionally and intentionally. Problems include lack of understanding of certain clinical concepts and reasoning, failure to perform a proper causation analysis, failure to conduct a valid risk-benefits analysis, and reliance on pseudoscience and pseudo-controversies. Number 5, non-specialists will almost always mistake pathological enmeshment for healthy bonding. Enmeshment entails severe boundary violations to the point that the parent has essentially engulfed the child. Non-specialists typically see the close relationship, but miss the point that it's too close, pathologically close. Enmeshment's a major risk factor for severe dysfunction and other severe complications in adult life. There are few things more damaging to a child than to be enmeshed with a parent. Number 6. The 8 manifestations of alienated children can and should be used for clinical and forensic diagnosis. From a scientific perspective, this is not debatable. To believe otherwise, one must lack even a basic understanding of certain elementary clinical principles. These include, but are not limited to, how to recognize false positives and false negatives, and how to recognize and avoid false dichotomies. Number 7. In the absence of an outside influence, such as an alienating influence, children rarely reject a parent. It's counterinstinctual for a child to reject a parent, even for abusive parents, so it's all the more true for a non-abusive parent. Number 8. parental alienation meets the standard definitions for child abuse, specifically psychological and emotional abuse. From the DSM number 5, page 719, child psychological abuse is non-accidental verbal or symbolic acts by a child's parent or caregiver that result or have the reasonable potential to result in significant psychological harm to the child. Physical and sexual abusive acts are not included in this category. Number 9. Since parental alienation is a form of child abuse, the number one priority should be protect the child from further abuse, not to work on the child's relationship with the rejected parent, although that's also a high priority. Nevertheless, failure to understand this runs rampant among mental health and legal professionals. Judges often reinforce this error, which reflects a serious misunderstanding of clinical priorities by issuing orders for reunification therapy without corresponding orders to protect the child. Number 10. Not only are traditional therapies of little, if any, benefit in regard to treating parental alienation, but they often make it worse, catastrophically worse. That includes most types of family therapy unless they're modified extensively and in specific ways. Traditional family therapy for parental alienation is contraindicated, which means forbidden. Number 11. Just because a child's doing well in school or other activities doesn't mean he or she's doing well psychologically or emotionally. This is one of the worst but most common mistakes. Many children find a safe haven in school or with other activities, and the worst damage isn't obvious and/or is delayed. Be skeptical when told that a possibly alienated child is supposedly thriving. Number 12. Just because a child is 16 or 17 years of age isn't a valid reason not to take action to protect the child from abuse, and parental alienation's no exception. Quite the opposite. The child's in need of urgent protection, and yet, in only a year or two, will be beyond the reach of the court and won't receive the urgently needed protection. It's nonsense to believe that such children won't cooperate or can't be forced. Number 13. There's no valid, credible, or objective evidence that removing an alienated child from the home of an alienating parent for a period of protective separation carries a significant risk of substantial harm. In fact, the opposite's true. In almost all severe and some moderate cases of parental alienation, the risks of not protecting the child are much greater than the risks of protecting the child. In brief, one must carefully consider both sides of the equation, the very low risk of harm with removal versus the very high risk of harm with non-removal. We mentioned 13 counterintuitive examples of parental alienation, but there are dozens of others. Professionals involved in parental alienation cases must have specialized training or the results can be catastrophic to the family. Adapted from the presentation of Dr. Stephen G. Miller and produced by the Law Center. Click the link in the description portion of this video to learn more.